international health regulations provide a vital legal framework for responding to the global spread of disease. But the pandemic has exposed shortcomings in the application and implementation of the IHR that I believe are best addressed with a convention, agreement, or other international instrument. We have treaties and other international instruments against tobacco, nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, climate change, and many other threats to our shared security and well-being. As you know, in December, the World Health Assembly made the historic decision to negotiate a WHO convention, agreement, or other international instrument to strengthen pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. This agreement, I hope, will be a generational agreement. It could be a game changer. An intergovernmental negotiating body, an INB, has now been established and has begun its work. Its outcome is to be submitted to the World Health Assembly in 2024. It includes countries from all regions and all income levels and is chaired by Dr. Precious Masoso of South Africa and by Dr. Roland Drees of the Netherlands, with vice chairs from Brazil, Egypt, Japan, and Thailand. Under their leadership, the IMB is operating based on the principles of inclusiveness, transparency, efficiency, and consensus. As part of the decision in December, the World Health Assembly asked me to hold public hearings to inform the IMB's deliberations. Public participation is crucial to that effort. Our Constitution says informed opinion and active cooperation on the part of the public are the utmost importance in the improvement of the health of the people. We're very pleased to have a wide range of participants today, from civil society, the private sector, independent experts, as well as philanthropic, academic, and international organizations. We're starting with the basics. Today's guiding question is, as Dr. Mahjour said, what substantive elements do you think should be included in a new international instrument on pandemic preparedness and response? I repeat, what substantive elements do you think should be included in a new international instrument on pandemic preparedness and response? We look forward to hearing from you. The success of the future instrument depends on it. Ultimately, whatever instrument comes, this process will affect everyone. So it's vital that we get the widest possible range of inputs. Thank you all for your engagement at this historic moment. I hope the legacy of this meeting, of the negotiating process, and the pandemic itself is a healthier, safer, fairer world for generations to come. A world together. And thank you for joining the work on this generational agreement, which we believe, I repeat, which we believe is a game changer. I thank you.
As I say, that was WHO Director General Dr. Tedros, as he's often referred to, giving the opening remarks at the public hearings for the new Global Pandemic Treaty earlier this month. And as I say, the entire live stream is up on the inb.who.int webpage, at least as I record this here in late April of 2022. I expect it will not be up there forever, so if you're truly keen on it, I would suggest now is the time to watch and or download these live streams for posterity. Although I can't in all honesty really heartfully recommend that. I suppose, as I say, I never dissuade people from taking a look at things. I'd say there's not a lot of meat on the bones here with regards to actual information that I think is really important for people to see, because it really does consist essentially not of the WHO actually engaging in any sort of talk about what this treaty will include or what have you. It really is a public hearing for various public comment, quote unquote, on not the actual necessity for such a treaty, but what should be included in this treaty, which they are working on. And you will note the framing of this, as Dr. Tim Ball made the point many, many years ago, and I think it's an important one. Commissions are always truly determined, and perhaps over-determined, by their scope and what it is they are supposed to be looking for. So if the IPCC is only interested in human causation of climate change, you better believe they're going to find and talk about and only dwell on human causation of climate change. And then people will report, oh my God, humans are causing climate change. And in this case as well, if the WHO invites public comment on what should be included in our global treaty, which we will then enforce with an iron fist, what should we have in there? And then they listen politely, and then they go ahead and do whatever they were going to do in the first place, but perhaps that's just me being cynical. Anyway, of course, even that is somewhat laughable, because of course the public comment is only really open to people who are part of international or at least big-scale NGOs of some sort that have a direct bearing and interest on the work of the WHO, etc., etc. So they already pre-screen any sort of public comment that takes place. So I have not watched every second of every one of these 4 live streams that are up there that consist of several hours of material at this point. I have flipped through quite a lot of it, though, and it consists of comment after comment after comment from various organizations talking about the need for inclusivity and fairness and equity, and please give us your life-saving vaccines and that sort of thing. There were a couple of comments that were interesting in that they actually were arguing for the right to be enshrined in whatever treaty is being worked on for people, say, to refuse medical treatment or to at least decide what medical treatment they want to have. Or then there was a comment talking about the need for looking at other types of treatments other than simply vaccines and things along those lines. So there was some interesting comment, but again, take it for what it is, which is simply public comment on what the treaty should include, not the existence of the treaty. So as I say, I think Tedros's opening remarks are a good place to start our examination, because they do give us an insight and a window onto what this treaty is about, where it's coming from, and broadly what it's aiming at. But perhaps the first place to go, if we really want to get a handle on this, is to the website of William Engdahl, williamengdahl.com, who had this post up at the very beginning of the scamdemic, 18th of February 2020, about who is whose Tedros Adhanom, going into the background of this character, in case you don't know who Dr. Tedros is and where he emerged from. You can get some more information about his role at the WHO and how he arrived there, and his somewhat controversial past, including ties, as you would expect. Nothing, I think, particularly surprising here, but ties to the President Clinton and a close collaboration with the Clintons and the Clinton Foundation and its Clinton HIV/AIDS initiative, and of course a close relationship with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he went on to chair the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria that was co-founded by the Gates Foundation. And I think the implication is that Tedros is in the position he's in because he is so connected specifically to people like the Gateses, and is willing to listen to what his paymasters tell him to do, which is a point that I made in the Who is Bill Gates documentary. At that time, citing the most recent donor reports at that time, I believe the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was the second largest donor to the WHO, only behind the United States. I believe that has changed in the most recent data that I've seen, although I couldn't re-find that data in preparation for this episode, but I'm sure people can find it out there. I think they might have slipped down to third or fourth at this point, as China and others are upping their game in terms of trying to contribute more to have a bigger say at what's happening at the WHO as it increases in importance, precisely because of things like the Global Pandemic Treaty.
So you can see that today we're working hard to come through with a lot of this good conversation that's coming across. The mass consciousness of the American intellectual progress that we're making here, as the technology is helping to facilitate a mass awakening, and information is traveling very fast. Information is viral. They're not really able to contain or control information the way that they could in the 80s and the 90s. We're at a point when the energy behind this move towards internationalism and globalism becomes something of an occult power structure that's behind the scenes, and now we can see that all the different digital transactions, all the different development of these scientific papers, and the conflict that's happening, the academic classes who are pointing out that many of these people that have credentials can't be trusted. And a lot of these academics and doctors and the people leading the arena of this biosecurity state that they're developing are people who are highly political and highly ideological, and they're being corrupted by the old system of nobility and aristocracy. Like we were saying before, I tried to include a nice article about the Knights of Malta have a Maltese hospital in Jordan, in the area around Jerusalem, around Israel proper, so that they have their own hospital system that has been in place for a very long time. And they have been hospitalers for a long time. And they have been on the cutting edge of working out and healing injuries on the battlefield so that their soldiers and their warriors and their warfare can be effective. And so this history of the Hospitaller Knights and their history with the island of Rhodes, their history with on Malta after the Templars were disassembled and destroyed and were made target of the great inquisitional powers of the papacy, so that the Templars were an incomparable force of wealth and military strength dedicated to defending the papacy and their holdings in the Holy Land, in the Jerusalem area, especially against the Muslims. And this connection between Islam and the Templar Knights, the Papal Knights, would take place at this time as they were fighting the Saracens and the Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, and trying to control the Holy Land and trying to control Jerusalem and Israel. They would come into contact with the Hashishin sect, which was a secret occult sect of highly organized and highly trained assassins who were basically operating completely in the blind, but they could be hired out by people who knew they existed, and they basically were, when their assassins were sent to kill someone, they would never fail, even if they had to kill themselves. Their fanaticism and their power over the fear of death was so complete in their training as Hashishins, or as they're called, the assassin cult. They would believe that they would, if they had to kill themselves and give their life and their mission, that they would be sent to paradise. And so the Templars have a record in the history and a written account and a chronology of this interaction with the man on the mountain. That's who he was called, the man who was the highest and most unassailably powerful captain of the Hashishin cult, the sect of the secret sect of the assassins, was called the man on the mountain, and he was the general of their order. He was an absolute monarch of that system, of that secret system, in which there's not a lot known about it, other than the Hashishins would use marijuana to a great extent, even as a hallucinogen, and other things too, to as part of their training. That's where the word hash comes in and relates to the idea of marijuana. And so that's what they were famous for, and kind of having grown the drug potency of THC to a massive extent, and having developed it to a high degree so that it was beyond medicinal, but it was something that was, like I said, hallucinogenic, and a very active ingredient in their occult system. So this secret society of assassins who existed up there in the mountains around Syria, and who no one knew about, was completely secret to the world, was something that was very deadly and very dangerous, and was something that finally reached out and ultimately made contact with the Templar Knights, and they have, like I said, have an account of it. So this history, this interaction between these two groups would become legendary, and there would be a sort of meeting of the minds and a sort of a development of the two systems, and they would merge in some level, so that a lot of what the Hashishans and the sect of the assassins there, what they had as a way of secret knowledge and esoteric concepts and scientific remedies and secret knowledge and so on, was made available to the Templars. And conversely, the secret sect of the assassins grew to a great degree to find out that they had a lot to learn from the Templars. They had a lot to learn about how to make really good steel. They had a lot to learn about the way to build with stone, so the stonework, the stone guilds. These stone guilds were legendary, and they would be the root foundation for the creation of Freemasonry later. The stone guilds would eventually, in their secrecy and their use of sacred geometry to build cathedrals and other unbelievably amazing architecture out of stone that we see all across Europe, those kind of ideas and that kind of knowledge is something that will be passed on and taken up by and derived by the Hashishans, the secret sect of the assassins there. So that later on, I think that they came out of a mystic Sufi tradition. But like I said, I'll have to go back and take a look at the documentation and do look at the research. But there was an exchange of occult ideas and mystical ideas between the Templars and the Hashishans. So this is something that we need to bring to the forefront here, because it has a lot to do with this connection between the papacy and Islam today. So as we're moving forward, as we're developing our storyline here, it's important that we don't take our eye off the ball, that the actual appearance of hospitals has everything to do with the hospitaller knights of the Pope. And today we have hospitals on every corner, but we don't know very much about the ancient antiquity and the original genesis of the roots of those normal institutions that we see all around us today. So ultimately, this ability for them to take charge of your life, because they have a hospital and they have doctors and they have the force of their unopposable medical science, right? They can make determinations. They can even put you in a 72-hour psychological evaluation and basically rope you off into a psych ward. Doctors have a lot of power. And so the power of this is growing to become more universal, as you can see with Dr. Anthony Fauci and this idea of medical science and the sorcerers thereof having the ability to ultimately make choices that affect the lives of everyone else in their life, in the country. And ultimately, when we're basically zeroing in on this World Health Organization, we can see that power structure of the biosecurity state isn't something that's just harassing different counties and different states here in America, but it's something it's attempting to raise itself up to become global and authoritarian and absolute, so that all these different nations of the world have to capitulate to the whims and the dictates of the World Health Organization. So that's kind of what we're bringing forth in this. We're trying to show the clips, show the information, show the analysis. It's kind of dense. There's a lot of information there. People don't want to do the intellectual, the rigorous academic tasking of going through and like looking at some of this. I'm just playing audio clips for you, but there's plenty of information that we can go over and try to add into this. And of course, I'd love your feedback. Go ahead and hit the email, send me an email, talk to individuals here behind the book club. And even the history of the American Medical Association, the AMA, was something that was established by members of Skull and Bones at Yale. So even the American Psychological Association, other big, overarching, all-encompassing boards of directors that we're supposed to all, believe have this, because they made an organization called the American Medical Association. We should all just do what they say and march lockstep to whatever their dictates are. So this goes back to the early 1900s when they come up and they create the American Medical Association. And this is guys out of Yale, not just Yale graduates and Yale alumni, but Yale skull and bonesmen. And like we talked about that a lot before, that's just an entranceway. They're called knights when they become skull and bonesmen. They're called knights, and they're considered to be knights of eulogio. So this whole theme of bowing to the Pope and kissing the Pope's slipper, this whole theme of Pope worship, which goes way past just being Catholic. I mean, if you're a Catholic and you engage in those particular practices, it's one thing, but being a Roman Catholic, in other words, taking all your Catholic direction from one center point in the Vatican and nowhere else is a strange thing to me, to think that people would do that. But that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing this ultramontane knighthood orders who serve the Pope, and they're really the ones who are behind instigating all this political power and plenary authority under the law to make all these dictates, because supposedly they're there to help out someone, and they've taken an oath not to do any harm, but to only do good. And so it's a strange thing when you see that there are these different virologists and epidemiologists are fighting it out and doing battle over the different social media accounts, and then the social media accounts are taking turns either amplifying their message or conversely just striking their message down and taking them down, and trying to control the narrative, trying to get everyone to believe that the information is like thus and such, and so no one can dare question it. And so this Fauciism, this absolute biomedical security state that we're seeing developed, is now becoming a global system, and it's been in the works for a long time, and it's coming online. And so we're working hard to really just bring this information out. And so if you just take a little time and run through the episodes here and just look up the information that we're trying to get you to look at, you can see that the history is right there, and it's something that's being suppressed, and it's not something that anyone's going to wrap up in a neat little bow for you to find out. But that's the underlying system of power that you're dealing with. So it's not just the cabal of leftists, right? It's not just the cabal of international globalist rich guys, which those are not necessarily mutually exclusive things. But the point is that what you're seeing in operation behind the George Bush presidency, behind all these different presidents, and this move towards international power, and this move towards the European Union, the development of that, what you're seeing is the outgrowth and the expression of the power of the Knights of the Pope. And there's different papal orders of knights, and they're sworn to by Holy Catholic religion, right? This is the thing this is the unchanging motif that leads all the way back to the Inquisition, to just ultimately do the will of their superiors without question. So it's absolute authority, absolute, unquestioning, unflinching authority to do what they're told to do. And it's this system of brainwashing and propaganda that we see really, really perfectly synthesized and distilled in the old Man on the Mountain and the old Hashishin cult, the sect of the assassins that the Templars just kind of came across. So they were so well hidden and camouflaged and covert that no one knew that they were really there until they kind of reached out and rode up on their horses, and they were part of the Islamic power structure that the Pope's knights were fighting against. And so they understood that these mystical Sufi warriors, the sect of the assassins, they knew that they were skilled killers, dangerous warriors that had to be reckoned with. And so that kind of leads to this culmination point where the two sides are going to really synthesize and come together and learn from each other. And then, of course, later on, all the Crusader knights, they would come home to France. They would come home to Languedoc. Is that right? This place in France. I can't speak French very well, but this place where there was this explosion and renaissance of new ideas and new information and new teachings, new medicines, new compounds, new wealth that was pouring in to France from the Middle East after the Crusade Wars. And a lot of that energy also would be used to go after the Pope's enemies, whatever heretics he would declare. If the Pope declared you heretic, you could agree or not agree, it didn't matter. you were a heretic, and the men were going to come get you. So that's the unquestioning, undeniable kind of religious absolutism and dictatorship that the papacy represented. Of course, in Islam, and it was not much different, they had a caliph who was the absolute God-man and religious high priest, or the highest and really just unlimited sovereignty of this monarchical position, that the caliphate commanded the power of God. And he was associated with Allah, the divinity, and he was associated with the monarchy, which is the temporal civil government, the rulership of the actual kingdom itself. So this is what you see over time. What's what you saw in Pharaoh. He was not just a king, but he had unassailable power, and he was also the high priest of the cult of Ra, or the worship of Horus and Set, and so on. So you see the same thing in Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar. He has to practice the rituals, and he has absolute rulership, and the same thing with the papacy. And you don't see that in our country and other countries too, where the secular role and the religious system are separated, so that the person who has legislative authority, or who is the judge, the supreme judge, or so on and so forth, isn't necessarily he's ruling regarding the letter of the law, but he doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the divinity or the running of the religious system. And so that's the kind of detail that we're trying to point out to you here. We're trying to get into this next level of detail and the actual characteristics of this system that is coming into place. So as we're going through these remarks from these guys, they talk about the empire builders and this process of trying to build a universal world empire on the ashes of individual sovereign democratic nations. So you can't have democracy when you have an imperium. And when you have a worldwide global imperium, everyone has to obey the imperator, so the emperor, the ruler. When we go back in history, we can see that just before the European Union, it was the Holy Roman Empire. And of course, they have the Holy Roman Emperor. And so it comes back to this process of trying to put holy and empire together to make a God empire, to make an empire of your religion. And it's the same thing that Islam does. And so we can see as Protestant people, Protestant Bible believers, we're going to be on the other side of that, just like our founding fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and so on. We're going to be men who want to have no world global empire, but we want a nation of our own to operate and to rule ourselves, and to have self-government, and to follow the Constitution that we set up for ourselves, and to have freedoms and liberties as free men in this blessed democratic republic, where we get to vote and choose our own direction politically, with political liberty. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the difference between these knights who serve the king and the pope, and we have over here free men who have liberty and who have gold and silver money, and who have their own ability to navigate the frontier of the world freely. And so all these different agendas, the environmental, Agenda 22, Agenda 33, agenda what have you, Agenda 21, United Nations systems that they're trying to bring online, these different kind of treaties for the environment, treaties for world health, powers over our country, and so on and so forth. We have to just work hard to stay on top of what these issues are. So before I go any further, let me just go ahead and we'll come back to these issues again, and we're working hard to establish the different facts behind these issues. And I think it's important to understand that as an American freeman who is interested in a small federal government, who's interested in having the sovereignty and the independence of your own nation, and a strong military, and the ability for you to defend your own nation, your own front door, and your own home, it's absolutely, totally diametrically opposed to the aristocracy of the princes and the nobility of Europe, who are there just to ride their horses over top of the serfs. Because the serfs are the little people. They're just the little people on the land who just dig mud huts, and they really have, they really have no standing, and they have no rights, and you can just mow them down if you feel like it. You can press them into service to go to war if you want. You can have prima nocta. Like, remember Braveheart? Prima nocta. So you can, if you're the landlord, you're the nobleman of the land, you can come down on the first night of marriage and bang the lady first. Before the husband gets to get in the marriage bed, he gets to have the first shot. Right? That was prima nocta. That's what they were doing in Scotland. That's what the nobility could do. So don't try to act like you're gonna be a Knight of Columbus and you're gonna be a pope worshiper and you're into the Vatican and you can actually be a freeman with democratic values in America in this republic, because they're opposite things. So you can't be a Roman Catholic and a Protestant reformer, okay, who belongs to sola scriptura, who belongs to the tradition of the Bible and of the free men here in America. Because that's what America is built on. It's built on the gospel. It's built on the concept that Martin Luther brought forward of sola scriptura. And it's built on the concept of free men who will fight to die for their liberty. And so that's what the Bible gives us. We don't have any fear of death. We know that the Lord brought us into this world, and the Lord will be there when we go out of this world, and we have no fear. We're not concerned about, we're just only concerned about our kids watching us be brave and fight against this global tyranny. It's the same global tyranny. It's the same system of aristocracy and principalities that were bowing and scraping and kissing the toe of the Pope that was in place during King George III. And nothing has changed. Nothing has changed about what's happening there. The system of papal knights who serve the Pope and who serve at the beck and call of the Vatican, those men are ultra wealthy men who own all these corporations, who designed Skull and Bones at Yale, who put in pathways of power for their organizations, who have been running the show and been on the board of the Federal Reserve governors all along. Like the first guy was a Skull and Bones man. He was put on the Federal Reserve governors. So you gotta understand, this whole system you're only blind to it if you're willingly a coward. But when it's brought to your attention and the information's made available and you check it and you go and look at yourself and you see that it's true, now you're accountable for that. You need to step up as a man, put aside all this popery and this Romanism and this Roman cult religion and all this wickedness. Even though these people are in high places, even though these people are wealthy, powerful men, it doesn't matter. We can still overcome, just like in Valley Forge. You got to remember, just like in Valley Forge, those men didn't seem like they had a chance, but they wouldn't give up. They wouldn't give up their guns or their Bibles, and they fought against the tyranny of the money powers and the globalists, and they won. So without going any further into it, let's listen to another interesting clip. And we're discussing the World Health Organization, and they're moving forward under this Biden, this weak, feckless, cowardly Biden administration, this perverted child molester president that we have. Let's just be real about it. The guy's a pedophile pig, just like his son is. And let's go ahead and take a look at how they're using him and stepping forward with this agenda to bring down America into just another global subsidiary of the new worldwide government that they're putting into place.
I want to go to Michelle Bachman now, the Dean of the School of Government down at Regent University, and someone that does these great webinars, also a candidate for president, and she's a former congressman. Congressman Bachman, Dean Bachman, you were the first to kind of bring this to our attention. You were in the war room last week. Walk us through, because people are just getting their hands around it right now. We're going to have Frank Gaffney on, Dr. Naomi Wolf. What exactly is going on in Geneva at the World Health Organization, and how do we get so far down the road of it looks like signing something that's going to expand the sovereignty, the ability of the World Health Organization in Geneva, controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, to affect the sovereignty of the United States of America?
That's right. It's hard to believe, Steve, but in less than 2 weeks' time, a vote will take place in Geneva, Switzerland at the World Health Assembly. They're important because they're the governing body of the World Health Organization, WHO. This authority that they would be given would impact 99.4% of all the people in the world. There are 193 nations belonging to the UN. The Biden administration is bringing amendments that would propose that all nations of the earth cede their sovereignty over national health care decisions to the WHO, the World Health Organization. So what this would mean, Steve, is that the WHO would have decision-making authority to intervene into the United States government policy in any nation of the world without our permission. So, for instance, the lockdowns where you see 26 million people today locked down in Shanghai, China. They can't leave their apartments or homes. The WHO would have the authority to be able to impose that here in the United States for whatever pretext they want. They don't have to show data. They could do this. What this does, Steve, bottom line, is it creates a platform for global governance. Global governance through the WHO. This is what people need to know. It's time sensitive. No one knew about this. The Biden administration gave these proposed amendments to the World Health Organization on January 18th. No one in America knew this until April 12th. Less than a month ago, the Biden administration posted these amendments. But in less than 2 weeks in Geneva, Switzerland, the delegates will vote on this. The Biden administration has already released a list of countries, 40 of the most powerful countries in the world, including Canada, including the EU, including the UK, including Australia. These countries are going along with the Biden administration's insane push to give sovereignty over the untrustworthy WHO. Again, this creates a platform for global governance. So it's extremely important. The vote is going to take place in less than 2 weeks. And no one effectively knows about this happening, but people are starting to know.
So back again with this second part of confronting the World Health Organization. And you can see now that it is starting to come out in the media a little bit, but they did work really hard in the same deceptive manner that they really worked hard to put Joe Biden away during the 2020 election and have him in the basement the whole time as they prepped the big steal. And of course, we can see now with 2,000 Mules, with Dinesh D'Souza's work. If you haven't seen it, then I guess you're blocking out the blazing rays of the sun and the truth as it becomes apparent to everyone that the 2020 election was in fact stolen, and there was a massive coordinated conspiracy of fraud. And that's what you're seeing in the Michael Sussman trial, too, a conspiracy of fraud. And it looks like a lot of people are going to start going down. That the Durham investigation is bearing fruit, and it packs a punch. And I thank God that Trump, on his way out, at least set that into motion. And you can see now that the Biden administration has gotten rid of its Ministry of Truth that it was going to set up with the Jankowicz lady, the singing fool, the actual jackass jester lady. And then she had the song about how she wanted to be rich and famous and just, do away with everyone else. And she actually had a show tune song about how she wanted to be a Bolshevik kind of fascist. And, of course, she's fired. And so, we can see that we're working together. We're aligned. Our minds are on the same wavelength. We're thinking each other's thoughts at this point. We're aware. We're conscious. Our consciousness is being connected in America. There's a mass awakening of a consciousness, and we need to work together to keep each other in the loop and keep each other awake and informed on what's going on. There's really no barrier now as far as confidential and top secret information is more likely to become more prevalent now than ever before with the speed with which technology has us all intercommunicating and interconnected. So we're a one world consciousness right now, and in America we have to recognize that. We recognize what's going on in India. There's mass food riots. You can see that the next year's food production reports are already looking really bad with the increased rate of prices for food and farming. And apparently we can't get any potash because they stopped doing all the mining for oil and for propane for gas. And so without that kind of drilling going on, we can't get the potash, and that's really what we need for the fertilizer for the farmers. So there's a complex system melting down here in America. We need to recognize that, and we're just trying to look forward here. This issue with the World Health Organization is absolutely imperative that we focus like a laser and do what we have to do to write some letters, make some phone calls, and push back against this. We absolutely can't allow it. It would be the prospect of this military government in Washington, D.C., with their war powers that are giving power to the executive branch right now, and you can see that it's just an empty suit. Biden's completely fried. He's retarded. His crackhead son is in hiding, and just like the Supreme Court justices are. And we have a state of emergency in this country, and they can't take on any more emergency powers without just having us all shot against the wall. They have to just put all of us against the wall and shoot us. I think Homeland Security has 35 quadrillion billion rounds of ammo, so I think they're all prepared. And you can see that we have a difficulty in this country, that ultimately this prospect of going to the World Health Organization and giving away our sovereignty and our ability to make political and governmental decisions on our own, with our own governors and our own legislatures and our own states, would just be completely eroded. So it's tantamount to what happened on March 6th, 1933, when the Emergency Banking Act and the Trading with the Enemy Act and the different proclamations that the executive orders that came out as presidential proclamations were something they turned the country on its head, and they turned all the American citizens with capital letters, right? They make it the conspiracy nuts and the Patriot movement. They make a big deal out of the capital letters when your name is spelled in all caps, because that denotes a corporate entity, that your name has been put into corporate law. So, inasmuch that your identity has become a persona, a commercial persona that could be traded in commerce. So, what that means is just as if you had a business, a painting business, and your name is Dave Allen, and you called your business Dave Allen Incorporated. You use your name to incorporate like that. That's the kind of corporate persona and corporate fiction that has been used by this illegal military government in Washington, D.C. to create a corporate identity out of your de jure living person, actual soul as an individual. So your birth certificate is going to frame you with a custom number and frame your personhood as a commodity for trade. That's what your birth certificate does. It lets them know how that they have an individual here and how much taxes they should expect to pay, and what their liabilities will be concerning how much Social Security and insurance costs for the individual will be throughout their life. And ultimately they make a commercial and fiduciary estimation. And this is a way to monetize people and turn them into a commercial instrument. And so your certification documentation is, at the beginning point, is your birth certificate. And like I said, you can see now how they are traded on the market and how they are used to help create government bonds. And bonds are something very similar to birth certificate. And of course, your death certificate will coincide when the end date of your life is and the end of your monetization and your commercial viability as a fiduciary agent of the system. So you're the full faith and credit of the American people is you. So whenever they do these huge tranches, they do this huge stimulus spending and print up billions of dollars of debt notes, that's borrowed capital against you. And they have in collateral your birth certificate and your documentation and your Social Security number. And ultimately, that was something that didn't exist before 1933. Something that came in after 1929, the Great Depression, when America was completely bankrupt, and the nation was entirely broke. And that's when the Federal Reserve System was going to take its collateral that was lost. So ultimately, once the American people are indebted and they can't pay back, then the only collateral left is themselves. So this is a way to tag the ear of all the cattle, and that's what these documents do. I mean, they're tied in with your supposed driver license. They license you to move around, and so ultimately, you can see that you're not free anymore, but you're really a subsidiary of the system itself, and you go around to earn Federal Reserve notes, so you can pay Federal Reserve notes to the IRS, and you can try to collect enough scraps of these paper money in order to eventually try to retire with it. Of course, the entire value and the purchasing power of your money is being dissolved with, no matter how much of it you've piled up or set aside for yourself, it's being dissolved by inflation and the massive prices that are going along with it, which will affect, of course, all the licensing when you want to go get your hunting license, because they license you to hunt. You can't just, you're not a free man, a freeman on the land, able just to go and eat from the land. You have to be licensed. You have to pay the county in order to, and for them to discharge you a permit. So you're permitted. You have permission. So this is the kind of situation you have to recognize that you're in. You've been in it your whole life. I mean, since 1933, you're talking about like over 80, 90 years now. We've been under these declared war powers that have kind of begun with the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which were a way just to, they had that banking holiday when they came in. The commander-in-chief was the sole executive government of the land, and they didn't really give a damn what the Senate or the legislature or the judges had to say about it. And so this became the de facto military government taking over in the collapse. Of course, the Roaring 20s, there was lots of money. The Great Gatsby, right? Everybody was dancing and having a wonderful time. There was money everywhere. People could become very wealthy. But after the Roaring 20s, a few margin calls involving JFK's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was a powerful Knight of Malta, super wealthy, phenomenally wealthy beyond. They were making a lot of money during the bootlegging period, during Prohibition, and of course they created Bacardi rum. Is that what it's called? I can't remember, but they created a lot of companies, made unquantifiable amounts of money as agents of the papacy and servants of the Pope, the papal knights. And of course, he raised his son up to become the president of the United States. And of course, his son was raised with a lot of character and a lot of integrity and a lot of honesty, a powerful sense, a burden of duty to the United States. And that's why they ultimately shot John F. Kennedy in the face. How they did. And they blamed Patsy, of course. So this is how the world is. This is how it is when you need to start to see the bigger picture and recognize that the forces of the papacy and of monarchical, the old ultramontane monarchical nobility, the old factions of the nobles and the kings of Europe had no interest in giving up their long planned goal of controlling the United States and bringing it down and ultimately defeating and finishing off the war against the Redcoats in 1776, right? Returning to that theme and that war once again to destroy the American people. Of course, we've survived this long. You can see with the transgender ideology and all the different ramifications of this Marxist, leftist, corrosive agenda of division politics. It's there to just bring the American people to a state of civil war. It's got to be addressed. We've got to recognize that they're creating an idea virus that's a virulent, self-destructive weapon within the American body politic. And we have to stand against it. And the next step here, the reason why I bring up 1933 and this process of bringing us all under commercial liability for the debt of the United States, you know what I mean? So as they borrow more and more and more, and Nancy Pelosi she has this huge spending orgasm up there in Washington D.C. Just their little side, their families and their little side businesses are all like Hunter Biden. They're all running around collecting all this money they print out as they wash it through different organizations. They send it to you and they send it back. They send it to you and they send it back. And lo and behold, later on they're all millionaires, right? That's what happens in Washington D.C. We all know it. So as they spend all this money and they blow this huge deficit out of the water and they begin to tank the American people, they're desperate to become independently wealthy so they don't have to worry about the ramifications of collapsing America and the ramifications of this massive debt cataclysm that they're catastrophe that they're bringing on the American people. Ultimately, the American people are on the hook because of our social security numbers, because of our birth certificates, and because we're a democracy, right? We sent our elected representatives up to Washington, where Washington has the power to print the money and create debt, and we told them that they had the keys to the kingdom and they could print out $1 trillion of debt in our names and we'll pay it back. But of course, lo and behold, I don't have $190,000. Actually, since the last time we talked, it's more like $210,000 per American citizen, man, woman, and child. Look at the faces around you in your home. think about your kids and your family members. Everybody here owes $210,000 to pay back this massive debt from Washington, D.C. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a financial genius to understand that they're killing us. They're killing us. And so the next step of this process of using the emergency war powers and this out-of-control executive branch and this Federal Reserve System that's pumping trillions of dollars of money into a system that we're borrowing, right? We're borrowing all this money in this massive federal credit card that our kids, and every kid we have who gets they're going to have to ultimately pay this back. Now, pay attention here. This Social Security number is just for the poor people. If you have one, it's because you're poor. Now, if you're like Bruce Wayne and you're a Dark Knight, right? Dark Knight of the Pope, right? And you can get away with it because you live up in a mansion, and whenever your mom and dad have a baby, they take the mom away and they put her up in a room in the mansion, and they bring doctors in, and lo and behold, she has a baby, and they take the baby in the next room, and it's over. But when you're poor and you go to the hospital, all of a sudden the doctor's got to write up a birth certificate for you and send it to the federal government and document you and sign you up to this process of getting a Social Security number so that your child could be indebted with this borrowing and this borrowing debt. That's what's happening when you go to the hospital and you're poor and you sign your kid up all proud to get a birth certificate, and they'll later send a Social Security number so that your child can be indemnified with this massive Federal Reserve debt so now that we can have another one that we can print out another $200,000 because now we have a new debt slave. So that's the system here. And it's very complicated. It's hard to explain. And this is not about conspiracy theories. It's about getting through to your head what it is you're losing in this country. You're in the process of losing your country because you don't have the ability to see the game that's being played in this uniparty system. The Washington, you got Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi holding hands, and it doesn't matter which color hat they have on or which party they vote for or whatever the Hegelian dialectic is between parties. They are indebting our children and our grandchildren into serfdom with this massive debt spending. So we need to get rid of the Federal Reserve. We need to shut down Washington, D.C., and we need to empower our Treasury once again to issue money and bonds and banknotes and empower the state governments to issue banknotes in terms of gold and silver that are actual. We don't need certificates and licenses for American people. We don't need birth certificates for American people. We need certificates of gold and silver so that we can trade with honest, solid, hard money to one another instead of these debt notes where whenever we pay somebody with these debt notes, we're really just stealing from them because we're giving them a worthless paper. We're passing it to them. We're passing that worthless debt monetization to that person. Of course, now they have a Federal Reserve note. They can go pay their ticket. They can go pay the IRS. They can become a nice serf in this Federal Reserve slave system. But it's time for us to get out of this debt cycle. So that's what this whole move towards the World Health Organization is all about, as these different states throughout the United States say, look, this is how we feel about abortion. This is how we feel about whether it's constitutional rights or not. As these state governments use their sovereignty to decide what they're going to do, all of a sudden here comes the global apparatus to come in and try to steal the power of the state governments away and to shut down this process of national sovereignty for each of these 50 states in the American Union. That's what you got to remember. We're part of a union. We're not slaves. We're not held here at gunpoint and run in their little hamster wheel to generate economic resources for this big pharma military industrial complex, this biosecurity state they're trying to build through the World Economic Forum with the funding of Bill Gates, as we're getting into the Bill Gates funding the World Health Organization. So this whole sick system of them trying to betray the vast preponderance of poor people in the world population into this system of forced sterilization, forced vaccination, the system of forced global takeover of your country because the United States is proposing these new amendments and this new treaty so that we could give up our sovereignty. And they think up there in Washington, D.C., and this emergency war powers executive branch thinks they can give away the rights of the American people and these states, the sovereignty of these states, to the World Health Organization. That's the ultimate fight. We have to decide now that we're going to make this stand. This is their big push. This is their big triangulation. This is their big stratagem in order to bring the American people and especially all the people of the world to their knees. And and they're going to do it with starvation. It's time to start growing your own food. We got our garden going. We have our we're putting food resources aside. We're getting some of these Patriot food kits, these Patriot survival food kits and stuff. We're setting aside the resources we need for this fight. So this is what it comes down to. We need you to participate, step in, and we're working hard over here to inform you. We need your support. We have lots of people coming, stepping in, and letting us know what they think, and starting to you can go and hit the Cash App, send us some resources. If you don't have that, email us. Let us know how we can, make a pay method available to you so that you can support us and we can continue this fight. But no, look, it's time to confront the World Health Organization. It's time to confront the United Nations and to realize that as they are imploding and collapsing the Federal Reserve system of debt on our heads, and it's spiraling out. There's not enough people here. We've aborted every fifth person here. Now all these illegal immigrants are pouring into the country by the million, who are here just to take up jobs and absorb a lot of this debt. A lot of this money is just going to be absorbed as they send it, to other countries and send it to their homeland, send it to support their families and so on. And so ultimately our debt notes are being dispersed out, and the American people are just becoming more inundated with fentanyl drugs, and they're being murdered by the CDC ultimately with this poisonous, ridiculous fake vaccine, which it really isn't a vaccine. It's just an experimental mRNA therapy, and it just basically stimulates your system to create all these spike proteins that clog up your heart and cause you to have a heart attack. I mean, they're just murdering people, and you got to recognize that we were tying in with our host the other night, tying in this whole picture of this is a continuation of the Counter-Reformation, and it's the justification for the deep state villains and the apparatus to make war and to commit democide against the American people, because the American people are the colonists. They're the Protestants and the Puritans that ultimately the system in Europe is against. The system in Europe looks at us like we are just gone astray, subjects of Britain we're traitors against the crown. Ultimately, we're ultimately heretics from the Rome's point of view. We're just here, and of course from the CCP, from the Chinese Communist point of view, we're ultimately just here to be wiped out so they can take over North America for their farmland in the future. So everyone has plans of ultimately destroying America. We have many enemies, and we need to recognize now that this process of the World Health Organization is a wholly owned property of the CCP and Bill Gates, who are some of the biggest funders, and we'll get into that in this episode. So once again, let's get into it.
It raises serious concerns about national sovereignty for countries all over the world, because countries do follow this, and essentially this is a ratification of everything that we saw with COVID-19. Now, going back, does anybody think that what the World Health Organization did during COVID-19 was a smashing success? I don't think so. What role did the World Health Organization play? First, they started out, as is widely known, by helping China cover up the virus. Next, they rubber-stamped lockdowns into policy based on very little. Lockdown is not something that was in any country's pandemic plan. It was actually had no precedent in the Western world since the Middle Ages at the very latest. But based solely on what the Chinese Communist Party said has succeeded in Wuhan, this ridiculous narrative that the super lockdown in Wuhan had eliminated the virus from all of China. Just a few weeks after that, China comes and tells the entire world in no uncertain terms, the World Health Organization's representative in China gives a press conference, tells the entire world what China has shown the world is you have to do this. Copy China's response to COVID-19. And based solely on that, he tells the entire world, regardless of what their demographics are, their economics are, even their number of COVID-19 cases, tells them all they have to do this. And based on that, one by one, like dominoes, the entire world starts to shut down. That really accounts for everything we saw over the past 2 years, from the lockdowns to the mask mandates to the mass testing and vaccine passes, this entire terror campaign. The PCR testing guidance from the World Health Organization. They issued this guidance that was also unprecedented. Western plans to, start mass testing for COVID-19 with PCR tests. It turns out that the cycle thresholds that were issued along with that guidance, which also came from China, by the way. The New York Times later confirmed that was an 85 to 90% false positive rate. It's an unspeakable crime what's taken place over the last 2 years. And now you have all these nations going to Geneva, Switzerland. The World Health Organization is asking for more power to do the same thing, not just the same thing, but more of it. And all these countries are saying, okay, that's great. Everything we experienced was just fine and dandy. Let's do more of it. And that's the real significance here.
We just had Dr. David Bell on the show, and he explained, I guess, the distinction between the international health regulations that are being looked at as we speak, and also this pandemic treaty that is being worked on that will be voted on, I guess, the following year. I just wanted to get you to clarify that, because it almost sounded like the two are being kind of conflated into one in what you were saying.
The amendments to the international health regulations are more immediate. The pandemic treaty, which is also being debated and being talked about, will be something that's passed in the future, and that's something that has not been drafted yet in any serious way, but will give the World Health Organization, again, a whole host of new powers if nations decide to go down that path as well.
So how is it that this actually validates these lockdowns?
So the lockdown was not part of any country's pandemic plan, not part of any, had no precedent in history prior to the lockdown of Wuhan, China. However, after the Chinese Communist Party in February of 2020 announced that their lockdown of Wuhan was a smashing success, the World Health Organization rubber stamps that into policy, and the entire world follows that endorsement of the lockdown by the World Health Organization. It becomes part of their own policy, and this is something that they're actually working on. It's not even up for vote. It's not part of the amendments to the health regulations or the pandemic treaty, but they have simply adopted lockdown as policy.
But these are a legitimate way of responding when all the evidence shows otherwise.
That's exactly right. They are adding legitimacy to these policies by signing on to the treaty. When you look at every single policy that was implemented in response to COVID-19, you find China's paw prints on every single policy, because it all comes back to the central lie that the lockdown of Wuhan, the response of the Chinese Communist Party in Wuhan was so super effective that it eliminated the virus from all of China. This ridiculous narrative. And every single one of these policies comes back to what the Chinese Communist Party said they did in Wuhan. The mass testing, they said, that's what worked in Wuhan, using the cycle thresholds that worked in Wuhan, do it there. Lockdowns, mask mandates, obviously vaccine passports has the China's paw prints all over it. Every single one of these policies, it turns out, was just, kind of laundered into policy based on the fact that our officials and our elites were rubber stamping this lie that the Chinese Communist Party has succeeded in eliminating this virus. And of course, even if that wasn't obvious enough, I mean, you look at this graph, which I put in the cover of my book. This is, supposedly the COVID deaths in China until Xi Jinping gives the order, and suddenly there's flat line. I mean, that graph they didn't even do a good job forging it, but that has been the basis for the world's response to COVID-19. And even more vividly, we've seen in the last year, suddenly China is back in lockdown again. So everything that we've been told by this biosecurity community over the last 2 years that, copy China, copy all these policies, has been, belied by what just happened in China. Now all of a sudden they're back in lockdown again. They never actually eliminated the virus to begin with. It was just a really ridiculous data fraud that somehow got legitimized by the international influence, the global influence that the Chinese Communist Party has developed over several decades within elite media outlets, within universities, with politicians, with think tanks. You see all of them. The closer you get to the centers of power regarding the response to COVID-19, the more likely people are to repeat this lie that the Chinese Communist Party actually did eliminate this virus. And it's very, it's eerie to behold, because everybody else can tell it's obvious data fraud, but apparently, the elites in charge of the response cannot. That's what's accounted for everything that's happened. But over several decades, they've developed an international network that treats these lies that crop out of the propaganda machine as reality. And so leaders take that and they say, the Chinese Communist Party promised to be carbon zero. Now we have to be carbon zero too. We have to cut emissions. Of course, the CCP, that means nothing to them. they take no action toward that goal. They don't, they're still producing the most coal of any country in the world. But the rest of the world actually does cut some of their emissions. And so we see this pattern wherein Western elites are treating the lies coming out of the Chinese Communist Party as reality. And with COVID-19, that gets kicked into overdrive because now you have this very obvious, ridiculous lie that through this, 2-month super lockdown of Wuhan, where they're welding people in, they were able to eliminate this virus from all of China, or nowhere else outside of China. I mean, you think about how utterly absurd that is. Apparently, this virus understands national borders very well, because you look at all the countries, China, this very porous border of billions of people, all the countries around there, their cases are all at all-time highs, but, China's still insisting that they had, 0 deaths the entire time. I mean, it's just utterly absurd. The real story here is straight out of ancient Rome. The tyrant, Xi Jinping, gave the order to launder this lockdown policy and suspend everybody's rights around the world, and that's exactly what his cronies did.
One of the things you noted is that in the international health regulations themselves, there is a focus on information management, if I recall correctly. So tell me about that.
Yeah, that is the most concerning aspect of these health regulations. The health regulations, kind of repeat all the things that the World Health Organization is doing. They want more testing, more tracing, more information gathering, more non-pharmaceutical intervention. There's all that, but that technically isn't binding on member nations. They have to not just approve those health regulations, but actually implement those themselves. And unfortunately, with many liberal nations around the world, especially, they simply rubber stamp those policies from the World Health Organization. So it is, very concerning for national sovereignty in that sense. However, in one area in particular, national sovereignty doesn't matter at all, and that's in this war on misinformation, this clampdown on misinformation, because in that particular area, the World Health Organization is not working through nations. Nations don't have to approve this. They are working directly with unaccountable private organizations, supranational companies, such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and advising them on who and what to censor. So that doesn't matter what country you're in. You can be in a country that's completely opposed to the World Health Organization, where you've done everything in your power to convince all of your leaders, your democratically elected officials, to not give the WHO any power. That doesn't matter because the World Health Organization is getting funding, and they're using that funding to work with YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter to censor your voice and censor those who you agree with and want to hear their views from. That will have an effect on every country in the world, how they respond to any pandemic, the information they get about any virus, regardless of whether they vote to give the World Health Organization any power.
How is this different, I guess, from what's been happening already when it comes to this draft of the updates to the IHRs?
It's just more of it. It's really, that's what it comes down to. It's everything that we've seen, all the extraordinarily harmful activity that we've seen the World Health Organization telling countries around the world to engage in over the last 2 years. They just want to do more of it. And so when you see leaders signing on to these health amendments, the World Health Organization, the amendments to the regulations, they're essentially, you can say, pledging allegiance to this biosecurity system, this horrible biosecurity system that we've seen over the last 2 years that's done so much harm all over the world. And those lockdowns have led to, the largest man-made famine that we've seen since the Great Leap Forward. They have, deprived children all over the world with years of primary education. Children are stuffed in masks for hours and hours a day, something I couldn't even imagine. It sounds absolutely awful just to attend school. They destroyed economies all over the world. In 2020, every single country in the G20, the largest 20 economies in the world, every single country had negative GDP growth except for China. China made a lot of money. It transferred trillions of dollars, $3 trillion in wealth from the world's poorest people to the very richest, small handful of billionaires who got rich off of this response, mostly testing and vaccines, and predominantly those were Chinese billionaires, so Chinese Communist Party members themselves. And what happened here is an absolute crime, an absolute heist. The World Health Organization is almost being used as a front for the Chinese Communist Party itself. leaders around the world, the fact that they're going there and the World Health Organization is saying, oh yeah, let's do all that again. Let's have more of that. And they're saying, yeah, that's fine. I mean, that's the power of the false reality that has been spun by the Chinese Communist Party and the World Health Organization. They're all signing up for that and pledging allegiance to that sort of false reality. This is all like that.
So here we have a word from our sponsor. And of course, we have a very brave and wonderful sponsor to come in. But you know about Wendy's Boutique. Wendy's Boutique Limited is the cutting edge of women's apparel online. The hottest new styles, all kinds of brand names. Just go to wendyslimited.com. That's how you can support us. You can support our sponsors. Let them know that Looking Glass Forum sent you. You get you some discounts. So look up wendyslimited.com. It's Wendy's Boutique Limited online. And with the hottest new styles, best women's apparel, best apparently bikinis, lingerie, all kinds of beautiful, sensual things that you need when you have a beautiful woman in your life. So wendyslimited.com, guys. That's where we need your support.
So I want to make sure I return to this point again, that you're not to be mystified and bamboozled by this system of global tyranny that they're putting into place. And I just want to add this little clip in here, because when we're listening to Geopolitics and Empire podcast, they have a really interesting guest. He's making the point that ultimately this system of world government that's being insinuated into our lives through the helpful NGOs, the non-government organizations that allow people like Bill Gates and George Soros and even recently Mark Zuckerberg, when he interfered in the 2020 election with $400 million or whatever it was. You're allowing all these different independent actors to begin to influence the direction of geopolitical power. And you can see that ultimately we're constantly asked to pay the enormous bill due in the United Nations and to pay for the World Health Organization and to pay for NATO and to pay for all these things. You can see that there's a design, a combination working against America to weaken us and bring us down. And the most dangerous part of that system of traitors and Marxian saboteurs, the Invisible Committee, right? The Invisible Committee wrote the book, Becoming Insurrection. So no one knows who they are, of course. It's the national security deep state. And they're linked up with the World Health Organization. You can see now they're desperately allowing into the country millions of illegal trespassers from all over the world. And ultimately, we have the situation arising where they're cutting the throat of America, and the World Health Organization is now pushing forward at this weakened state where the American people are sickened because of the outbreak of this biological weapon, this viral warfare that we've been dealing with. And I think that you can see that the intelligence weapon, the intelligence asset of the Russians and the Chinese is really Joe Biden. They put their Manchurian candidate into the White House, into the Oval Office there, and now you can see that America is falling apart in every level. So it's going to be a desperate war of attrition, a fight for survival to get to the end of the line here where we can actually sort it out. And you can see that they're already talking about monkeypox and all this stuff, and they're trying to surge forward so that the World Health Organization will be in control of lockdowns and public policy in the United States, over and above the wishes of any of the governors or elected officials. So this unelected international, supranational committee of politicization of healthcare, right? In as much as that the CDC has been totally just following the dictates of the World Health Organization for a long time. And that's why I wonder, I mean, supposedly Trump was the president, but he really didn't get anything accomplished. He took us out of the World Health Organization, and ultimately Biden just turns around and puts us back in, and now puts forward these new amendments which would turn us into just another vassal state who receives orders from Brussels and from Europe and from the center of international power, which is what the World Health Organization and the United Nations is all about. So now we're in the ultimate fight for survival. You're going to find out now why the Amish make their own clothes and milk their own cows and, earn their own keep on the land, and they have wood tools where they don't need electricity, so they can build and they can create their farms and homes by their own skill. And so that's the kind of American independence and versatility and self-sufficiency that made this country so great. And many people in this country still have that, and we need to get back to it. It's time to start growing your own vegetables in your garden, canning your own food. I mean, we're gonna face a downturn that no election is gonna be able to save us from. And if they push onto us and ram through this World Health Organization legislation, they'll be back with their abortions. They'll be back to tell the transgender kids in school that the boys who can have pregnancies, that after these boys get pregnant, they can have abortions, right? That's what we're going to tell everybody. That's the triple speak and the no think that's coming out of Washington, D.C. And you got to recognize what it's all about. And in order to kind of comprehend the nature of what this situation is, you have to look back in history and see what is the war that's unfolding behind the scenes. And this next clip is really great because it points out that ultimately London, the city of London, the banking empire that's behind the throne and the crown there in Great Britain, ultimately this system of fractional reserve banking imperialism that ultimately brings everyone under the debt of the banking masters there in London. The system in England, that the empire, the British Empire as it were, was being converted into worldwide global empire. A system of internationalist global empire. And so that's why you have the rise of the United Nations. The United Nations was built on land donated in New York City from the Rockefeller family, who owned huge tracts of land there. And they just donated a huge spot for the United Nations to put their building there. So you have to recognize that ultimately this system that's being built through the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, and the United Nations, and on, the system of world empire that's being built out was really in the works when Cecil Rhodes was around. So you have to go back to the round table, the secret round table groups, and they were the ones who connected with their American counterparts. Ultimately, the technocratic state is being built up by the world's elites, and this system of aristocracy is at play in the background. In the system of, you have to understand that Rockefeller himself was a Knight of Malta when he donated the land of the United. They're going to these secret societies. They become high-level Freemasons. And if you go look at the chart, when you become a high-level Freemason, you become involved with the knighthood orders, who are acting out the wishes of their masters in Rome. So it's a system of aristocracy. It's a system of monarchy, and it has everything to do with opposing the political liberty of free men who are having a constitutional republic. And in such a constitutional republic that would liberate every man from any kind of liege lord or master or king. So there's no slaves and there's no subjects. Of course, that's diametrically opposed to men who want to serve a king and who want to be knights and who want to gain, ascend into nobility, into the aristocratic classes of power and wealth. And that's the oligarchy, man. That's the global system of power. Ultimately, and the Vatican is at the center of that. And these men who are building out the United Nations and the World Health Organization are serving their masters well and trying to bring the rest of us under this political domination. So it's really global tyranny. So this particular global tyranny seeks to replace states' rights altogether. You can see that they're pushing this. They're moving quickly to push as many people into the country from south of the border as possible. Ultimately, Ukrainians are coming over by the tens of thousands and coming over the border because it's easier than trying to get a paper. Just fly to Mexico and walk across. So we right now have millions of new people in the country. We have no idea who they are. They're criminals trying to escape their home countries. They're people that are ultimately looking for work, who have family members here, but they're breaking the law to come here, and they're coming here after they've broken the law to become part of the subservient working classes who have no real rights. They might try to go vote in elections, but they're not supposed to. They might try to use false identities to go to states like California and get driver's licenses. They won't be reciprocated in other states, but you know, they're just an underclass society, and ultimately they're here to make sure that they can achieve their goal of creating a North American Union. And that would dissolve ultimately the states' rights, that would dissolve the borders, and that would dissolve America's constitutional liberty as it was known and as it was constituted in 1789 or what have you there. So all this just to say that this process of resisting Democrats' sellout of America, they're selling out and betraying America's future to the whims of this internationalist oligarchy. And you got to remember, the Counter-Reformation was really what was at work here when we were dealing with Archduke Metternich when he was serving his masters, when he constituted the Congress of Vienna in 1815. And that, like I said, that's just on the heels of the resurrection of the Jesuit order. So in 1815, they're getting right back to work. They're going to do everything in their power to bring down the effects of the Reformation and the effects of freedom and the Bible in the hands of the common man and the common language and French and English and so on and so forth, so that in German, so that people could read the Bible and see and have their own relationship with God, and they didn't need the church. They didn't need the rituals of Rome. They didn't need to go tell their sins to a priest or do 5 penances or 5 Hail Marys or what have you. They would just have a relationship with a living relationship, a spiritual walk of faith with the God of the Bible. And so this created the Reformation, and this created the Holy Wars, the supposed 30 Years' War, and so on and so forth that followed as people decided that they would have their own personal relationship with God outside the authority of the papacy and of Rome. And when they did that, that was a declaration of war. And so that's what Metternich is doing in the Congress of Vienna. It's a mimic of the Congress of the Jesuits. It's also a joke on the Congress of America. And the Congress of Vienna has constituted all the kings, the crowned, bejeweled heads, the noblemen. Remember, Prince Metternich is ultimately a Knight of Malta, right? So he's serving in the knighthood orders. He's a high-powered man, high-powered Knight of Malta, papal knight. So Metternich is going to be ultimately elevated to Archduke, and he is going to have great powers. And he is there to bring about a historic reference point of the ultramontane power structure, the white power structure, if you will, as they sought to declare secretly and openly or what have you, the war against all Republican, democratically elected, constitutional governments of free peoples around the world. They were springing up everywhere. Constitutional republics, people who were setting up democracy. And you can see that in the last decades that many nations like Venezuela and all over South America and all over the world, even like Iran was a totally different nation if you go back to 1970s. It was a totally different world over there. And it's just been totally turned inside out. Same thing when they kind of installed Saddam Hussein as the dictator over Iraq. And they just turned that country into a shithole despotism. They had rape rooms of the citizens were totally. It was like North Korea over there, with Saddam Hussein in charge. So these are the kind of dictatorships and kings that they set up in the same way that the British set up the Saud family dynasty to become the king of Saudi Arabia, and they just created their own boundaries, and they cut up the Ottoman Empire, they created their own borders, and they made the Saud family the king. That's why Osama bin Laden was trying to fight them and was getting kicked out, because he just didn't accept that this was all there was for the Muslim world, just this little section of the map that was delegated to them by the British. So ultimately, the British Empire is being converted into an international system of world government, and it's supposed to superimpose and make obsolete the nationalist governments of the past. That's why there's this huge push against nationalism. Ultimately, Trump kind of put the red hats on and made this big push for nationalism. And of course, that means that the different nations of the world have their own sovereignty. This has been being dissolved. The French and the Swedish and the Italians and the Germans have all given up their sovereignty as independent nation states to become part of the European Union. So these other countries are ready to become part of a global international empire that's ruled by delegation from, that's what the international from Brussels or what have you. That's what the International Criminal Court's all about. They're trying to get sovereignty and jurisdiction over American citizens, and ultimately we're going to lose our country. So this fight for freedom and for independence and to keep America's sovereignty uncorrupted and protected from the whims of these individuals, they're at war with America because America was founded as a Protestant nation, and they have sworn oaths to destroy every Protestant nation and every heretic king and everywhere make secret and open war against all those that they've declared to be enemies of the Pope. So that's what this whole thing is about, with the Jesuits and the knights who bow the knee. Ultimately, they answer to the archbishops. So that's what happens in New York City. That's what happens in the Grand Cathedral there. That's where Cardinal Spellman was the one orchestrating the Knights of Malta and other papal knights from what they call it, the power station down there. So these are the details of the world that is the occult and undeclared secret world power that people are not discussing. No one has the intellectual acumen or just the historical background or the consciousness of the different factors in the infighting and the struggle for freedom that takes place. And people might not really be concerned about what the elite power structure does over there in the Vatican, but ultimately they're planning through these different agencies, and these different international instruments are being situated just the way you see the Chinese developing their systems of war. Just as we're shutting down now, they have more naval ships than we do, and then we're shutting down our army, we're transgendering it, and of course they're preparing their armada, just the same way that they did when they tried to go against Queen Elizabeth for the same reasons. The Spanish Armada was a huge battalion of ships that was sent across the channel to destroy her, and of course it failed, and of course they're just doing what they've always done. It's the same details when they tried to blow up James I, King James, in Parliament and the gunpowder plot back in 1605, and if you go back and rewind the tape back more to 1572, you can see the St. Bartholomew Day massacre. The Queen Medici there, she worked with her Knights of Malta at the time, the Hospitaller Knights, and then she worked with her Jesuit priests, and she made sure that those bastard Huguenots paid. They butchered them and killed them. They weren't going to allow there to be another Edict of Nantes or some kind of like peace where the Protestants were allowed to read their Bibles and to conduct their own religious affairs in peace. No, they had to either do it the Pope's way, as the Vatican mandated from Rome, or you were a heretic and you were to be killed. That's the doctrine. That's the doctrine today. And so if you're not aware of this, the bloody anathemas and the calls for all of the theologians of Rome to basically burn heretics and destroy them and make war against them. That's what it's all about, guys. That's what they're doing here. That's what the World Health Organization is here to do. It's here to be this great mask and this great gambit for power, for world control that we're supposed to all bow down and accept the authority of. And so it's really disappointing that the CDC has been allowed to become so politicized and made such an instrument of this international conspiracy, which is exactly what it is. And so Tedros and Bill Gates and the Chinese Communist Party and Soros, they're all up to funding this whole process by which we're going to supposedly allow Joe Biden to sign away our rights, our constitutional rights. So it's time for you to buy ammo. It's time for you to recognize that some of these, I'm sure there's a lot of really good men in the FBI, but as long as they're going to be going out in task force to just obey, just so they can keep their pension and just keep their paycheck going and go and just do the will of whoever's next, who's going to be after Joe Biden, right? So it's ridiculous that they're just taking orders without any ability to think about what they're doing. They're acting out a campaign of political warfare against the American people because they have some transgendered Black Lives Matter masters in Washington, D.C. kind of paving the way towards this atrocities that are being developed here. So they're pushing the American people into a corner, and they're appealing to foreign nationals and illegal immigrants to basically push their way ahead and replace the American people. So this is the replacement doctrine. And, the turnstiles and the taxes and the coins, the toll booth coins that get thrown in the toll booth, the automated collection booths, everything will just keep on rolling, but you can just take out all the European whiteys who were the Protestant, Anabaptist, Puritan, Presbyterian, Lutherans, who came from all over the world to populate America, and now you can just bring in this hordes and waves of almost like soldiers, like battalions, like 10,000 men is a division, right? So these are divisions on divisions on divisions of foreign invaders who are now going to rummage across the land. And as the economy starts to go down and people the jobs become scarce and the money crashes and the food famine scarcity, it's going to be a crime wave. So you need to buy ammo, protect yourself at any event, because the FBI is not going to come out and protect you against divisions and divisions and divisions of illegal immigrants who are now trapped in a famine-plagued America. And then you have the World Health Organization already getting ready to jump on the monkey pox thing, and they want to shut down. They can't have a fair election, and so by November they got to shut it down. I'm telling you, they're going to be back to doing their old tricks. This is a power struggle of colossal proportions, and you need to get involved. You can't just lay around and listen to this crap on the internet in your pajamas. You have to make preparations to survive this. This is a survival game. So you need to have neighbors, be connected with your family. It's time to prepare to batten down the hatches and weather the storm that's coming here. So here, this next clip is a discussion, and of course the information we'll try to make sure we add it in, a discussion relating to the foundation as far as the roads, Cecil Rhodes' huge fortune being used to construct this plan for a global system of absolute world power.
And, if you put some of this information together, you can see that the goal has always been world government. It's in their documents going back a century. Usually it's coming from the British elites, European elites. Myself, as a Christian, I believe this as well. The Bible prophecy kind of talks about this. You read that book of Daniel and Revelation. It implies there's going to be a global government and some kind of system where if you don't submit to the system, you can't buy or sell. And from what I put together from Matt's and Johnny's work was you can go back to Cecil Rhodes, that wealthy British magnate. Rhodesia was named after him, which is today Zimbabwe, I think. He wanted to create a world government. He says, in his own words, he left his money from his will for this purpose to create these British roundtable groups, and he wanted to basically use the British Commonwealth as the template. Think about how Cecil Rhodes was going to use the British Commonwealth as the foundation for create a world commonwealth. Which countries were the first to go crazy lockdown? The British Commonwealth countries, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, so on. And so that's been the goal. He created the Rhodes Scholarship. Many of these elites doing the lockdowns are Rhodes Scholars, and then the Council on Foreign Relations. First it was the Royal Institute, and then the Council on Foreign Relations in 1919. And then you get to the creation of the CIA, and then Johnny talks about how, what was it, in the 1960s, Klaus Schwab went to Harvard, and then at this international Harvard seminar that was sponsored by the CIA, and that's the genesis of the European Management Forum, which becomes the World Economic Forum. And the European Management Forum's goal was to unify Europe and the US into a supranational union. Again, the genesis of a world government. So that's where all of this is headed. The World Economic Forum is the face, the branding of this push to create the world government. And Willem Engel, who I interviewed, says that you've got the WEF instructs our ministers, and then behind the scenes, you've got all of these consultancy companies like McKinsey and many others that have already made the laws for this COVID stuff. They give it to the politicians who just have to sell us on it. And so that's kind of the infrastructure to get this all across. I mean, how else do you see everyone working in lockstep from Kazakhstan to Mexico? And a lot of these elites are globalists. I worked at the Nazarbayev school. I've been to his library in Astana, Nur Sultan. He's a total globalist. He's got books talking about globalism. So,
because it's so wild, you finally get your head around these superpowers and trying to...
Yeah, all of what you said, physical, precious metals, property, land, buy a car now. They might not be, they said they're not going to be manufacturing gas-powered cars, after 2026 or whatever. And if you have land, buy quality tools that are going to last, a long time that you're going to need, hammers, shovels, all of that stuff. And so, yeah, and then as you say, manage your, have your digital crypto assets, whatever, but make sure you have also the physical, everything kind of covered as much as you can. It's like what we're going into. I've been saying since 2020 that this is, well, even before 2020, I've been saying that we're going into another World War III scenario, like 1930s. Economic collapse, rise of authoritarianism, and the World War. I just never thought it would be global like we just saw it happen over the 2 years. Like I thought I could just leave the U.S. The U.S. will become more fascist. They're creating the domestic terror units to go after people who like the Constitution, who are conservatives. I mean, it's going pretty much like Nazi fascist. But now it's like you said, it's a global level. So it happened so fast. Like a lot of us knew this was coming, but it's still surprising when it comes.
And you got to remember, behind the King of England there and the Queen Elizabeth II, she's getting very old. Soon there will be a new king in England, and there'll be the big great pomp and circumstance and celebration over that as they bring out their white horses and they march the king out and do a great celebration. It'll be, everyone in the world will be watching it as they coronate this king. And of course, the coronation will go through this system of religious control, by which you ultimately have the Vatican and the different sold out Vatican Pope's men there in the Anglican Church who are going to come out and all the knights that are there, all the powerful knights, the Knights of the Garter, the Knights of St. John and the Holy Sepulchre, which is in Jerusalem. Of course, it's all about controlling Jerusalem in a military way. It's why they're military orders, they're sovereign military orders of Malta and so on, who are ultimately there to control their positions and their footholds that they have in Jerusalem, because they serve the Pope. And that's the Pope's holy land. That's his holy city. And so ultimately, you have this great union of Romanism, Islam, and traditional Jewish culture coming together in Jerusalem right now as they kind of fight over the control of that territory. And so you can see the apocalypse, if you go to the Bible, the apocalypse and the War of Armageddon is all fought over Jerusalem. So you can see these powerful military orders are interested in keeping their ability to come in and out, their ability to travel there, their ability to live and set up their great castles. They still have big stone military installments and placements there, and they even have the chapel of the Holy Sepulchre there, which is obviously a Roman Catholic archdiocese. So they have an archbishop. They're going to have priests. They're going to have all the system of Rome there in Jerusalem. And they're insisting that ultimately that's their right, and ultimately it's at their good pleasure that they want to conduct religious affairs as they see fit. And so that's what you're up against. That's what we're up against here in America. Here in America, we had constitutional amendments against any royal titles and princely surnames, and and this process of having ultimately a caste system where you have the nobility and the royals, and then you have all the rest of the common serfs who have no name. They're illiterate. They can't read. They can't write. They just do what they're told. They come up and open their mouth and receive their little wafer from the priest, like a good dog who gets a treat. That's the extent of their religious devotion or experience, is basically to just receive whatever they're told to receive from the hand of the power elite and the Roman priests. So here in America, we have the right to religious freedom. We have the right to bear firearms against encroachments of the state and of any kind of invader who will come and stand against our home or try to burn us out or take our stuff or harm our women here, or if we have lady folk around, we're here to protect our home front as men. And it's the same thing. All those particular, the Bill of Rights and the whole meaning of the Declaration of Independence was to create a new political liberty for people who believed other than the system of orthodoxy. There was the Roman inquisitors, the Roman priests, and the papacy, who ordained and commanded and dictated to everyone else what was heresy and who was going to be burned and who wasn't, and that people should be burned. So this was a place where the Inquisition never burned anyone in auto da fe. This is a place of liberty and freedom from that, to go into the world and to have your own right to your life, right? So that's so crucial. You have to understand that's not something that you had a right to under this system of nobility, under the power of the oppression of the aristocracy and the princes and the nobility in Europe. And of course, you have to understand that those high priests of the Vatican, the archbishops, and so on and so forth, they are princes of the church. They have princely titles too, and they have station and principality and a title of nobility in that system when all the other serfs and all the other common people basically are just undocumented bastards who can just be used and abused at will. They're the slave class. So that's the system that Rome has always been worked on, even before the Pope showed up there, even before the time of Christ. That's what Rome is all about. It's about imperial domination. That's what put Christ on the cross. That's a Roman cross. So we have to remember what this fight is all about. And the people who set up the Constitution had a clear indication of the system of despotism and tyranny coming from Rome. Ultimately, Napoleon went down there and arrested the Pope in 1799, right? Wasn't it General Berthier or whatever? And it broke his power. Well, that power was restored in 1933 with Mussolini. So that's something you need to know about. It's something we're going to do some more episodes about. But the political power of the principality and the nobility and the titular geopolitical strength of the Vatican city-state was restored by Mussolini during that period, 1933. So that was the Lateran Treaty. So you need to go look that up and see what happened there. So that Pope's power in the international system is restored. He has his own. He's considered the king of his own kingdom there. They create their own currency. They have their own stamps, like we said before. They have their own system of taxation and police and courts. And when you go to the United Nations, and you look at all the different nations of the world that are represented there, right? There's the Holy See. So the Holy See of the Vatican is considered to be its own nation state. That's something you need to know about. It's about political power that establishes a 200-acre property with a little, the little castle on it, and makes the Pope a king, a religious king, a holy monarch. All right, so that's the kind of power that they have going on over there, and they're leaning in and playing both sides. That's why you see, if you go down and look at protests happening at the Supreme Court, they have Catholics for abortion. And then if you go listen to the other side of the political dialectic, you can hear that there's Catholics that are against abortion. So the whole point is they're for and against everything. If you go look on Twitter and online, you can see that there's priests who are for abortion and there's priests who are against it. Right, like Father Pavone on the War Room, so he's against abortion. But if you go look at they talk on the other side of their mouth, there's a whole segment of priests who say that they're sticking up for women's rights, right? Especially at the academic level, the priests there are all liberal or whatever. So they just occupy both sides of this, and it's the same thing in Washington D.C. with our rhinos and our political elites, the political classes who are kind of ruling over us and spinning us into the ground, and who are really here to cut our throat. I mean, think about how humiliated Biden really is. What a just a completely emasculated, worthless shell of a man, and now he's just a seething ball of hate and psychopathy at this point. His mind is broken. His children are just human wrecks, right? And completely depraved and perverted. I mean, he's just totally different than, it's totally sickening. And ultimately, he's now having only the power and the strength to try to cut America's throat as his last act. So we have all these 80-year-olds, these George Soroses of the world, who are, they're not happy just to go into that great night, go into their coffin and go into death and get, and pass away, and in gladness and gratitude that they had a great life. They're just monsters now, right? They're just holding on to the last remaining seconds of their lives to try to do us, like Nancy Pelosi, do as much as harm as they can. They might live on and on and on, but they'll eventually have to go and meet the Lord and have to face the judgment for what they've done. So just keep that in mind as we're living our lives. We have to remember that the Lord sees us. We're the meek of the world. We're going to inherit the future. He sees our plight as poor people, or people who started out with a desire to have a free country and the land of the free and the home of the brave and a constitutional republic. It was built on the ability for all kinds of people of faith to freely practice their own beliefs without being persecuted, or without inquisitions of Rome or papal masters who, can lock you into dungeons or torture you. So that's the kind of thing that was the muscle memory and the recent contemporary experience of the Americans who first showed up here to just get out of there. All right, it was just an escape hatch, and they just left. And so I don't think they meant to bring all that here with them, but in many ways, if you look at the Salem witch trials, they did. They brought a lot of that mentality with them. So ultimately, we have to recognize that we're in a fight of the American Revolution, We have to stick together and support one another and find ways to, to work with our neighbors or a marketplace. Go to find places to transact with people locally without having to go to Walmart and just constantly spend our money with different organizations and companies who hate us. Same thing with Disney. No more groomers, right? No more funding organizations who are so sick. So here, let's listen to this next clip.
Border walls and containment walls. We know the U.S.-Mexico border wall, but actually there are over 70 border walls all around the world, and they're going up every day to either lock in or keep out unwanted populations, systems of mass surveillance and tracking, and that's a big theme of global civil war because that's the digital application that makes that possible. Militarized urban policing, paramilitary and private armies and security forces, and then there's direct and structural violence, such as the intensification of mass debt, and then debt collection, violent and state debt collection. We increasingly see the blurring of military and the boundaries between military and civilian forms of the global police state, blurring the boundaries between active war zones and urban civilian theaters. It's the megacities of the world that is ground zero for global police state. I don't know how much detail you'd like me to speak about, but here's some dramatic data. You interrupt if I'm going into too much detail. 140 countries passed these so-called anti-terrorism laws after 2001. And almost in all cases, they are still in place, and they allow for this global police state. In California, where you're interviewing me, I'm here in Los Angeles. There's no less than 592 laws restricting standing, sitting, resting, sleeping, panhandling, food sharing, in public spaces. So this is a way in which global police state now increasingly controls our public spaces, and of course that's aimed at the marginalized population, surplus humanity, getting them out of sight. But it's also aimed at the left and of popular mass rebellion and mobilizations, because it's a way of further controlling public space, and now with digitalization that has been greatly enhanced. So that's some of the dimensions of this first aspect of global police state, which is an incredible intensification of systems of transnational repression and social control. But here's the second dimension, which people are less aware of, and it's equally important, and it's how global police state is unbelievably profitable. And this is what at a time of stagnation in the global economy, this is what I call militarized accumulation, or accumulation by repression. And we know that the events of September 11 of 2001 led to this much more sweeping militarization of the global economy and society. We've been living in a global war economy. What the Ukraine conflict has deepened the global war economy. It's deepened militarized accumulation. So the Pentagon budget increased from 1998 to 2011 by 98%, nearly a duplication of that budget. Worldwide, between 2001 and 2022, the global military state spending doubled. And now as well, it's over $2 trillion. But this doesn't include state secret budgets, police and intelligence budgets, homeland security budgets, but even more significantly, because if we included those, we're talking about $2.5 trillion or more. But it doesn't include private corporate spending on global police state, mercenary firms. Let me give you some of this data. In 2018, what we call private military firms, and these are private for-profit companies, basically mercenary companies, and they're deployed all around the world. They participate in hot wars and low-intensity wars, in systems of repression. They fuse together with state repression. They defend corporate property, etc. There's these private military firms employed 15 million people worldwide in 2018. That's the year that I finished the research for my book. Private police and security forces number 20 million people worldwide. 20 million. That's in 1/2 countries of the world, they outnumber public police forces. The biometrics industry, which is the new biopolitical regime, which is emerging post-COVID, and was before the pandemic, valued at $35 billion, and it's exponentially growing in the wake of the pandemic. We now have 200 private prisons on all continents, and that number is rapidly expanding. Here's another piece of data. I'm throwing out all of this data because it's shocking the extent to which the global economy and society has been militarized as a form of profit-making, even when we put aside the issue of the need for the ruling groups to have social control. The European Union border security program spending increased by 3,688% between 2005 and 2016. And you might say, well, this is governments doing that, but this is global corporations running these border repression programs. There's also now a multi-billion-dollar market for what's called global riot control systems. In fact, one intelligence firm for private intelligence reported, and this is in the book, that, quote, there will be a dramatic rise in civil unrest all around the world, and this will generate demand, exponential increase in the demand for riot control systems. So this is some of the dimensions of how the whole global economy is completely militarized as a form of massive profit-making. We want to remember that the war in Ukraine may be a tragedy for the people of Ukraine, for the people of Russia, actually for the world's people, for the world's working people. But it is an unbelievable bonanza for the military-industrial complex and also for the global financial complex, which is tied in with it.
I thought as well during the pandemic, I refer to it as the Great Reset. I think the lockdowns, in my opinion, were that they were intentional, and their purpose was to wipe out the middle class because they locked down small businesses. But Amazon and Walmart and all these big box stores could stay open, Costco. But everyone else, I viewed it as this class, as you say, intentionally wiping out the competition, the small businesses, just to keep their monopoly. And I also wanted to ask you about, I've heard the term algocracy, ruled by algorithms. Some elites have been talking about this system where we would be controlled by a world government surveillance state run by algorithm. And maybe if you could comment on that. You mentioned briefly in your book these transnational state apparatuses, which I guess we can also call IGOs, international governmental organizations. You say they're not to be confused with the global government. I'm of the opinion that we are moving into world government with institutions that work in tandem, like World Bank, IMF, UN, EU. We've got this WHO pandemic treaty, which they're saying wants to take control of sovereign nation states. But, a lot of these private interests are behind this. You mentioned a big pharma, Wall Street, Davos, military-industrial complex. What are your thoughts on, I don't know if you want to talk about it now or after the pandemic, but this idea of, world government or transnational state apparatuses?
Right. I've been writing about what I call transnational state apparatuses since the late 1990s. And I mean, at this point, there's no doubt whatsoever that transnational capitalist class, let's talk about that for one moment. There are capitalists, small capitalists, medium-sized capitalists, and again, small capitalists have been millions wiped out by the pandemic because the incredible concentration and centralization of capital in the giant global corporations accelerated by the pandemic. But the leading heights of the capitalists worldwide is the transnational capitalist class. They don't recognize that they belong to particular nation states. They operate at a global level. And what they all share, these transnational capitalists around the world, is they want an open global economy where they can freely invest, and they interpenetrated across borders all over the world. So they have been organizing politically, and they've been organizing in function of their profit-making together across borders for the last 20, 25 years. And they link up with the leading political organizations of the transnational elite, including, you mentioned some of them, the World Economic Forum is really the nucleus of that political organization. So there absolutely is, whether you want to call it a transnational state. But here's the thing: there's a lot of evidence that COVID was also is also has gain of function properties. Luc Montagnier, who was the French virologist who discovered the HIV virus and then for it won the Nobel Prize in medicine, he already identified this gain of function properties. And there was a Freedom of Information Act that forced the emails of Fauci during the beginnings of the pandemic and the CDC to be released. So those Freedom of Information Act exposed that what Fauci's right-hand man emailed him on the eve of the World Health Organization calling COVID a pandemic, declaring it as a pandemic, emailed him and said, uh-oh, Fauci, we're in trouble because I just reviewed the data and this is gain-of-function properties. Now, this came out of the Freedom of Information Act as the email exchange. This is gain-of-function properties, and it was made in Wuhan, and we have helped finance, the National Institute of Health and the CDC have been working with and helping finance the Wuhan lab. And so Fauci responded with damage control. So, but here's the thing. I'm not suggesting that this is an intentional pandemic. But the point is that the drive for gain of function and the drive to expand vaccine markets in order to make profit is part of the story of the pandemic. But I want to say that prior to COVID, the global vaccine market was valued at $40 billion. And the challenge for Big Pharma, for the medical industrial complex, etc., was how do we dramatically expand that? And now the global vaccine, I mentioned 31 billion just in profits just for Pfizer. So there's this exponential increase in the global vaccine market. Once the pandemic hit, these actors all came together to launch a particular response to the pandemic, one which would drive private property and intensification of social control. So you saw DARPA. DARPA is the Pentagon's research branch coming together with the pharmaceutical corporations, with the World Health Organization, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, with the World Economic Forum. They all came together to develop a vaccine. But prior to that, these same actors had been meeting for the previous 20 years in a series of what they called scenarios. So here's where you get the issue of a transnational state apparatus. And these scenarios in which they had literally gamed, just like you have the Pentagon has war games to imagine this is how the conflict will unravel, will unfold. They had all of these scenarios or games in which they're imagining, now we're in a pandemic, how are we going to deal with it? How are we going to control it? How are we going to respond? And so I just mentioned, two of them. Going back to 2010, Rockefeller Foundation and the Gates Foundation financed a lockstep scenario. And according to that scenario in 2010, that's a decade before the pandemic, they said a pandemic would start with a coronavirus. And here's an actual quote from that scenario. The Chinese government was not the only one that took extreme measures to protect its citizens from risk and exposure. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified in order to protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics and transnational terrorism to environmental crises and rising poverty. Leaders around the world took a firmer grip on power. So this is these ruling groups that I mentioned. This is their scenario of how is that going to unfold, and they are applauding it. They called, for 20 years, have been calling for mandatory vaccines for the entire world's population, and are still calling now for mandatory vaccine passports, the corporations, the Gates Foundation, for mandatory vaccine passports all over the world, So the point here is not that the pandemic was pre-planned, but rather the plans, and this is the clincher, the plans were already in place for a capitalist response to any outbreak involving corporate domination and windfall profits and an intensification of mass social control as the new normal. One other quote here. On the eve of the outbreak, the World Economic Forum, by the way, everything I'm saying here is public knowledge. I mean, none of this is debatable, right? It's all just simply the facts. The World Economic Forum, the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security, which is funded by the Gates Foundation, the World Health Organization, the leading executives from the pharmaceutical corporations and government officials, including from the CDC and the Health and Human Services, but also from the CIA and all of the Pentagon apparatus. Okay. All of them came together. This was in fall of 2019, just a few months before the pandemic. And this was the latest of all of these scenarios. And this exercise was called Global Pandemic Exercise. This was literally months, 3 months, this was September into early October, so 3 months before the outbreak in Wuhan. And the exercise recommended the following. At the end of it, it said, this is what we recommend. Quote, governments, international organizations, and businesses should plan for how essential corporate capabilities will be utilized during a large-scale pandemic. Governments should partner with private media corporations to develop the ability to flood media with fast, accurate, and consistent information. Trusted, influential private sector employers should create the capacity to readily and reliably augment public messaging, manage rumors and misinformation, and apply credible information to support emergency public communications. Media companies should commit to ensuring that authoritative messages are prioritized and that false messages are suppressed, including through the use of technology. And that's exactly what happened during the pandemic and is still going on. It is transnational capitalist class and the capitalist states which tell us what is the truth and what is not the truth, and then censor us. And the left has played into this because the left thinks that if you criticize the official narrative, coming as it is from capital and the capitalist state, that means you're a Trump supporter, it means you're an anti-vaxxer, anti-science, it means you're a right-wing libertarian, etc. And that is a lot of nonsense.
All right, so that really is an interesting, you have to listen to the entire interview with the professor there, Professor Robinson, and you can see that we're digging deep to provide a wide range of information to really put together the whole network so that the entire puzzle will come together, and we can see that there is a transnational apparatus, transnational state apparatus that works together, transnational elite. And even though I'm not a socialist like the professor, I can still follow his research enough to understand that there is something that we have to deal with as a nation that's going to become increasingly difficult. And around the world, the Hessian soldiers, the Hessian warriors for hire who are waiting in the wings to be put into action as mercenaries, as United Nations blue hard hat peacekeepers, and so on. And you can see that the growing rise of instability here in the United States is carefully calculated, and these are the metrics of eroding and destroying a complex and powerful society like America, so that they're corrupting the youth in the classroom, and they're destroying the foundations of fellowship within society, and the fraternity of the different individuals within society is being seeded with hatred and animosity, with the different political demagoguery and these BLM sophistry and the tactics used to mask up the population and create political antagonism. And you can see that they're doing everything they can do to try to bring down American society. And so with this episode, we're trying to help you to see the larger backdrop of the extreme danger that we're in this country by not having all the information and being ignorant as to the different machinations and the different power players and the principalities and those who are enthroned in the world as monarchs and who are sworn from powerful groups that are centuries and centuries, 500-year-old organizations who are sworn to bring an end to the history of democratic nationalism in the world and to bring all of the world's population back under control of these ultramontane nobility and aristocracy, the transnational elite who control the resources of the world and who want to control and ultimately abort many of us with the depopulation policies that they're bringing about. And you can see that these are the old aristocracy and papal knighthoods and nobility. And they really haven't changed their stripes. They're still really just the same exact barbarian, Dark Ages, bloodthirsty despots that they have always been. And we here in America have really learned to become a wonderful civil society with rights where generally the society and the individuals in the society protect each other's rights and work hard to understand each other's particular freedom and individual sovereignty as a citizen to expect to be able to participate in society and to vote and to move freely. And these are just not the Constitution. These are not ideals that our enemies understand. And so we have to remember individuals like, when I was reading Fahrenheit 451, there was individuals like Latimer and Ridley, who in Oxford, very late into the 1800s, I think, when people weren't burned at the stake very often, were burned at the stake in Oxford to point out that they were not going to be ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they weren't going to be bullied by the papists who were consumed with running around and trying to find out who was a heretic and making accusations to the Inquisition and having the Grand Inquisitor come in and find do torture and find guilt and burn people at the stake. And these were all the works of the papists and the Roman ritualists, as they were called. And the freemen and the Protestants and the Lutheran and the Baptists were reformers. They weren't going to have any of it. And so we have to remember Latimer and Ridley, who fought for what America is fighting for now, for the freedom of free men to have their own life, liberty, and property and pursuit of happiness. And that's what we're working hard to remember here in this particular show here in Looking Glass Forum. So thank you once again for coming back and joining with Looking Glass Forum and with the book club here. And we hope that you'll reach out and give us some feedback and tell us what you think. And also support us. You can go to Cash App and support us there. So thank you, and we hope to see you back here next time.